Imagine it is 60,000 years ago. You are sitting near a fire at the edge of a cave. It is cold. It is dark. Everyone is quiet. Because one of the people in your group has just died. Not in a hospital, not in a clean bed, not with doctors, machines, paperwork, and someone gently saying the time. They just stopped breathing beside the same fire where they ate, slept, laughed, argued, and waited out storms. And now the group has a problem, because the person is gone, but the body is still there. And that is where one of the strangest human stories begins. What do you do with a dead body? Do you leave it? Do you move it? Do you cover it? Do you burn it? Do you bury it? Do you come back to it? Do you talk to it? Do you give it food, tools, beads, flowers, animal bones, or a tiny object that makes no practical sense unless you believe the dead still matter? Today, the answer feels obvious. We have funerals, coffins, cemeteries, graves, tombstones, flowers, relatives in uncomfortable clothes.
And one person who says he would have wanted this, even though nobody knows what he wanted because he never left instructions about the sandwich platter. But for ancient humans, death was not organized. Death was physical. Death was right there. And a dead body was not just emotional. It was dangerous, confusing, and impossible to ignore. Because if you leave a body near camp, the body changes. The smell arrives. Insects arrive. Scavengers arrive. Predators can follow the scent. Children see things they cannot understand. The group has to sleep next to someone who used to be a person and is now becoming part of the landscape. That is a very ancient kind of horror. And it raises a question that sounds simple, but is actually enormous. When did humans stop treating the dead like objects and start treating them like people who were still somehow connected to us? Because that might be one of the moments we became fully human. Not when we made a sharper stone tool, not when we learned to run farther, not even when we learned to make fire, but when a dead body stopped being just a problem to remove and became someone to remember. At first, the practical answer was probably distance. If someone died near the sleeping area, you moved the body away. That sounds cold, but it was survival. A body attracts attention. Not just emotional attention, actual attention. Hyenas, wolves, big cats, vultures, insects, and anything else looking for a meal did not need an invitation. Nature sends very clear notifications, and ancient humans did not want those notifications delivered to the front door of the cave. So, moving the dead away from camp may have been the first step. Not religion, not philosophy, just, please do not let predators learn where we sleep. That alone could explain a lot. But it does not explain everything. Because humans did not just move bodies, they began placing them, arranging them, covering them, returning to them, decorating them,
putting objects beside them. And that is where the story changes. There is a big difference between throwing a body away and burying someone. One says, this is dangerous. The other says, this was ours. And the archaeological record is full of that difference. Some of the earliest possible burials are still debated because archaeology is basically detective work where the crime scene is 100,000 years old and everyone involved is extremely unavailable for questions. But by around 100,000 years ago, there is strong evidence that early humans in the Levant were intentionally placing bodies in graves. At sites like Kafsa and Skul, in what is now Israel, archaeologists found early modern humans in positions that do not look random. Some were placed in pits. Some were associated with objects. Some were connected with red ochre, a pigment that shows up again and again in ancient symbolic behavior. Red ochre is just colored earth.
But humans used it for tens of thousands of years in ways that suggest meaning. They put it on bodies, they used it in art, they carried it across landscapes. And if you find red pigment in a grave, the question becomes, why? The dead person did not need paint. They did not need decoration. They did not need a better outfit for the afterlife, unless someone believed the afterlife was going to be judgmental. So the pigment was not for the body. It was for the living. It was a sign, a ritual, a way of saying this moment is different from every other moment. And then there are the Neanderthals. For a long time, people imagined Neanderthals as stupid cave brutes, which is one of the most successful insults in history and one of the least accurate.
Neanderthals survived Ice Age Europe for hundreds of thousands of years. They hunted huge animals at close range. They controlled fire. They made tools. They cared for injured group members. And they may have buried their dead. At Shanidar Cave in Iraq, archaeologists found Neanderthal remains that seem to have been placed in the cave, not simply abandoned. One famous individual, Shanidar I, had severe injuries and disabilities. He had a damaged arm, impaired vision, and other trauma, yet he lived for years. That means other Neanderthals helped him survive. They fed him, protected him, kept him in the group. And when people are willing to care for someone who cannot hunt, cannot contribute like everyone else, and still matters, that tells you something important. Their social world was not simple. Then there is the famous flower burial from Shanidar. Pollen was found near one of the bodies, and for decades people imagined Neanderthals laying flowers on the dead. It is a beautiful idea, maybe too beautiful. Later researchers argued the pollen could have been brought in by burrowing animals or natural processes. So we should be careful. The flowers may not be proof. But the debate itself shows how powerful burial is. The moment we see a body placed carefully, our brain wants to know, was this grief? Was this love? Was this ritual? Or was someone just trying to keep the cave from becoming the worst possible bedroom? The answer might be yes, all of it, because human behavior often begins with practicality and then grows a soul. You move a body because it smells. You cover it because predators come. You dig a pit because the group needs safety. But then someone hesitates. Someone remembers the person's voice. Someone remembers who taught them how to sharpen a blade. Someone remembers who shared meat during a bad winter. And suddenly the body is not just waste or danger. It is memory. That is how a practical act can become sacred. One of the clearest ancient burials comes from Panga ya Saidi Cave in Kenya. Around 78,000 years ago, a small child died. The child was about 3 years old. Archaeologists later nicknamed the child Mtoto, which means child in Swahili. The body had been placed in a shallow pit, curled on its side, knees drawn toward the chest. The head may have rested on something soft, like a pillow or support that later decayed. And the body seems to have been wrapped or carefully arranged before being covered. Think about that. 78,000 years ago, someone buried a child carefully. Not efficiently, carefully. That word matters, because a group under pressure does not spend energy on a dead child because the child can help them tomorrow. The child cannot hunt, cannot gather food, cannot carry water, cannot grow up. From a purely cold survival perspective, the child is gone. But humans are not purely cold. That is the point. Someone dug. Someone placed the body. Someone covered it. Someone walked away from that spot knowing exactly what was under the ground. And that is not just disposal. That is grief with a shape. Burial gives grief a job. When someone dies, the living are left with panic. What now? Where do we put the body? Where do we put the pain? A grave answers both questions at once. The body goes here. The memory goes here too. That may be why graves became so powerful. They turn loss into a location. Without a grave, grief is everywhere. With a grave, grief has an address. You can return to it. You can bring something. You can speak. You can cry. You can leave. You can come back. That might sound modern, but the impulse is ancient. And as humans became more complex, burials became more complex too. At Sungir in Russia, archaeologists found one of the most extraordinary Upper Paleolithic burial sites ever discovered. It dates to more than 30,000 years ago. There was an adult man. There were 2 children buried head to head. And with them were thousands and thousands of ivory beads, spears, pendants, and red ochre. More than 13,000 beads were found at the site. Not 13, not a cute little handful. 13,000. Each bead had to be made by hand, cut, shaped, drilled, polished. That is not something you accidentally drop in a grave like spare change. Some estimates suggest the beads could have taken thousands of hours of work. Imagine that. People spent enormous time creating objects for people who were already dead. That is almost irrational. And that is exactly why it matters. Humans were spending labor on meaning. No animal needs a bead in the ground.
No corpse needs a spear. No skeleton needs jewelry. But the living needed to put those things there. Maybe to honor them. Maybe to show status. Maybe to prepare them for another world. Maybe to tell everyone else, this person mattered. And maybe, just maybe, to tell themselves, death did not erase them completely. That is the emotional engine of burial. Burial fights the most terrifying idea in human life, that a person can be here one day and gone the next. The grave says, not completely. Something remains.
Even if it is just a place. Even if it is just a story. Even if it is just a pile of stones that tells the group where not to step. And once humans started living in larger groups, burial became even more important. Because death creates social problems. Who gets remembered? Who gets buried where? Who gets objects? Who gets a marker? Who gets nothing? That is not just emotion. That is politics. The dead can still affect the living. Ancestors can justify land claims. Graves can mark territory. Burials can show status. Funerals can bring groups together. And sometimes, a dead person becomes more socially powerful than they were alive, which is honestly very human. By the time we reach Natufian communities in the Levant, around 15,000 to 11,500 years ago, people were becoming more settled before full agriculture. They built more permanent places. They used cemeteries. They buried people with shells, teeth, bones, stones, and personal ornaments.
At Ain Malaha, an elderly human was found buried with a young puppy. A puppy? 12,000 years ago, someone placed a human and a young dog together. There are many ways to interpret that. Maybe the dog had a special role. Maybe it was companionship. Maybe it was symbolic. Maybe ancient humans were already the kind of people who looked at a dog and said, "Yes, you are coming with me forever." Which, honestly, sounds about right. And at Hilazon Taktik Cave in northern Israel, archaeologists found the burial of a Natufian woman surrounded by extraordinary objects and animal remains. There were tortoise shells. There were parts of wild animals. The burial suggests a complex funeral ritual, maybe even a feast. That is another huge step. Now the dead are not just being buried. The dead are organizing the living. People gather. Food is prepared. Objects are placed. Stories are told. The body becomes the center of a social event. In other words, the funeral is born. And funerals are strange if you think about them too literally. A group of living people gathers around someone who cannot hear them, brings food the dead cannot eat, says words the dead cannot answer, and then feels better afterward. From the outside, that makes no sense. From the inside, it makes perfect sense. Because funerals are not only for the dead, they are for the living. They tell the group what happened. They give everyone a script when nobody knows what to say. They transform shock into action. Dig here, place this, stand there, say these words, remember this person, keep going. Without ritual, death is chaos. With ritual, death becomes something the group can survive. That may be why every culture on Earth develops some way to handle the dead. Burial, cremation, mummification, sky burial, caves, tombs, cairns, cemeteries, bodies placed in boats, bodies wrapped in cloth, bodies painted with pigment, bodies surrounded by tools, weapons, food, jewelry, animals, coins, or messages. The details change, the need does not. Humans cannot just let death be a biological event. We turn it into a story, because that is what humans do with things we cannot control. We narrate them until they become survivable. And there is something else burial does. It hides the transformation. Death is not only sad, it is visually disturbing. A dead body forces the living to see what they will become. That is a brutal mirror. Burial closes the mirror. It gives the body back to the ground before the body becomes unrecognizable. It protects dignity. It protects memory. It lets the living remember a face instead of a process. This is why modern people still care so much about how the dead are handled. Even today, with science, hospitals, and funeral homes, we still react strongly to bodies being treated disrespectfully. Because somewhere deep down, we do not see a corpse as just matter.
We see a person who has crossed a line we all know we will cross too, and we want that line handled carefully. So why did ancient humans bury the dead? There is not one answer. There are layers. They buried bodies to protect camp from smell, scavengers, predators, and contamination. They buried bodies because the group needed distance from decomposition. They buried bodies because grief needed somewhere to go. They buried bodies because memory needed a place. They buried bodies because status, family, territory, and belief all became wrapped around the dead. They buried bodies because humans are the animals that cannot leave meaning alone. A dead body could have been just a problem. Instead, humans turned it into ritual, into graves, into ancestors, into cemeteries, into pyramids, into tombstones, into stories told long after the body was gone. And that is the strange thing. The dead do not build civilization, but the way we treat the dead reveals what civilization is. It is not just tools, it is not just fire, it is not just food. It is the moment a group decides that someone who can no longer help, speak, hunt, or answer still deserves care. The first grave may have started as a practical solution. Move the body, cover the smell, protect the camp, keep predators away. But somewhere along the way, that simple act changed. The hole in the ground became a memory. The stones became a marker. The beads became a message. The body became an ancestor. And the living became something more than survivors. They became people who remembered. So the next time you see a cemetery, or flowers on a grave, or someone standing silently beside a tombstone, remember, that is not just tradition. That is one of the oldest human instincts still alive. Long before writing, before cities, before kings, before money, before anyone had a word for history, humans were already doing something extraordinary. They were looking at the dead and saying, "You are gone, but you are not nothing." And maybe that is why we bury. Not because the dead need the ground, but because the living need a way to keep loving someone after they can no longer love us back.